Christi Jo Nichols was a 22-year-old from Gothenburg, Nebraska. She was married and had 2 children. On the evening of December 10th, 1987, Christi and her husband Mark went out for a night on the town. When they came home, their babysitter left. The next morning, Mark woke up. Christi wasn't there. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. As I talked about last week during the Q&A episode, all types of crime are down in the United States since the 1970s, despite the perception being otherwise. One of those categories is domestic violence, and I think this is the one that would be the most unsurprising. Women, who are of course most often the victims, although men in both straight and gay relationships can suffer too, women have a lot more avenues to escape these days. They're much more independent. They are believed. And technology such as recording and videoing while the abuse is happening certainly helps them back up their claims. And it's not only women who have changed. Men are held much more accountable. It is not just a given that men can get away with slapping around their wives to keep them quote-unquote in line, something that was accepted in Western culture as recently as the 1960s. Even on their own, men are learning to be much more open with their anger issues, and much more willing to seek help than at any time in history. Yet, violence at home continues, and I'm not sure it will ever totally go away. And in the case of Christi Nichols, there's no doubt she suffered at the hand of her husband, Mark. She talked about it, and people saw the injuries. Yet she stayed. And nobody really helped her, at least until Christi started thinking about getting divorced. Then she was gone. And we're left to decide if her disappearance was the result of a cycle of abuse. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's website, charleyproject.org. Christi Nichols was only 19 when she got married to Mark Nichols, a guy just a couple years older than she was. To this day, nobody knows how the two met, but Christi's family suspects it was a matter of Gothenburg, Nebraska being so small and everybody eventually running into somebody. Mark, despite his age, had already been married before. In the divorce, he did not get custody of his child, so he and Christi had 2 kids of their own. Yet the marriage was very troubled. Both allegations and evidence of abuse persisted. There was also the rumor that Christi had another man, and that she was contemplating a divorce of her own in the weeks before she disappeared. So on December 10th, 1987, Mark and Christi, despite the state of their relationship, went out. They were seen around town, drinking, laughing, and playing pool. A babysitter took care of their children during these hours. Later that night, the way Mark tells it, he and Christi came home. The babysitter got paid and left. In the morning, Mark claims he woke to find Christi gone, along with some of her clothes and a suitcase. She was never seen again. However, the babysitter tells a different tale. She claims she never saw Christi that night when the two came home. Mark has explained that the babysitter simply didn't see Christi because she went directly into the bedroom when they got home. There's no proof either way as to who is correct. Christi's disappearance fits a familiar pattern we've encountered many times on Unfound. Spouse says the significant other just went missing. Simple as that. With the rest of us left with nagging doubts and questions. For Christi's case, these are those questions. Number 1, Why was there a dried small circle of blood found in the bedroom of Christi's house after she disappeared? Number 2, what are we to make of a note under the seat of Christi's car that stated she planned to go away for a while? And number 3, Christi's suitcase with clothes in it was found a few months after her disappearance. Who put it there? Christi's family is firm in their belief Mark murdered her that night, and that the babysitter is telling the truth in that Christi never entered the Nichols home. The guest for this episode is lostandfoundblogs.com writer and owner and confidant of the Nichols family, Heather Grotman. Unfound news. We had an unfound meeting this past weekend. We're cooking up something new. Not sure where it's going right now, but in these times of quarantines and lockdowns and self-isolating, we are trying to bring something new to all of you who are stuck at home. Assistant Eric is in charge of it. I will keep you posted on the progress. Next, I found out that a disappearance Unfound covered a while ago, like going back to the first year, is getting a new private investigator involved. I had a chance to talk to this guy last week. He heard the episode and wanted to know if I had any more insight. Unfortunately, I don't. But he and I agreed there are avenues in the investigation that haven't been explored, due to one particular scenario getting all the attention. When I can reveal the actual disappearance and any progress, I will do so. Finally, the blog I wrote for Patreon this week is free. It's available on the Unfound website, theunfoundpodcast.com. In this week's writing, I expound a little bit more on a few of the answers I gave during the Q&A episode. Enjoy. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound supports accounts on Podomatic, iTunes, Stitcher, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, Deezer, and Facebook. On Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, please join us on the Unfound Podcast Channel on YouTube for the Unfound Live Show. All of you can talk with me, and I can answer your questions. And for Patreon this week, I need to thank Pamela. I'm so happy to have back on Unfound the writer, blogger, and owner of the website Lost and Found Blogs, Heather Grotman. Heather, welcome back to Unfound.
Hello, Ed, and thank you so much for having me back on.
It's great to have you. Now, listeners should know that they know that I don't have too many bloggers on the program, mostly family members, but Heather's blog is very special in my view, much like Anthony at thecrimeblogger1983.blogspot.com. They do things the right way. They don't just pick a disappearance to write about and do that. They take the time to get information. They talk to multiple family members, and they try to get things right the first time. And Heather, I just want you to know that I appreciate you doing things that way, and that's why you're on the program, because I really respect your work.
Well, thank you so much, Ed.
You're welcome. Let's start here. Being that you do have in the capacity in which you cover these disappearances, you can pick the disappearances you want to cover. What spoke to you about Christi's disappearance?
Well, this case would be in my top 5 easily. I'd watched her segment for over 20 years on Unsolved Mysteries, and honestly, her husband Mark just really angered me in this interview. I mean, even the facts presented in Unsolved Mysteries seemed obvious that he was involved, but at the end, he goes and makes an on-camera appeal for Christi to return or call in, indicating that she had abandoned her small children. And that always aggravated me, and I was determined to dig a little bit deeper and write an article on the case.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that when you saw maybe the original Unsolved Mysteries, of course she disappeared in 1997. Do you know if that came out in 88, 89? Any idea?
I'm not sure. I think it may have been a year or so after she went missing that they taped the film.
Okay. And so then all these years later, it still bugged you that much that when you started your Lost and Found blogs, that was one you wanted to cover, and it stuck with you that much.
Yes, and Mark was still walking the streets. Nothing had ever happened to him, and Christi was still missing.
Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, because as we both know, there are 80 to 90,000 missing persons cases in the United States, if the numbers are to be believed. So there's a lot, of course, to pick from. So it's always interesting to me when somebody picks one out. Why is that? And I think that you have a great motivation here. Let's move on to this. So that's why you picked this case. It stuck with you for, let's just say, roughly 30 years, until you had a chance to write about it. How did you go about researching this case? FOIAs, conversations with family members, friends. How did you get started, your research into this case before you wrote about it?
I didn't really do a FOIA. I was more interested in reaching out and finding her family members because I knew that they would want more attention to her case. And it was a little bit tough at first, but I actually kind of went on Facebook and I came across her brother's Facebook. And I sent him a message and he replied right away. He was happy to talk to me. And then he gave me Connie's phone number, which is Christi's mother. And I've gotten so much information. I've spoken with her for hours. And then I also found several articles on the newspaper archive website about the case back then as well.
Okay. And how long would you say that you worked on her disappearance for the express purpose of putting it in the blog before you actually wrote about it and it ended up so the public could see it? I mean, is that a week's worth of work or months? What would you say?
I would probably say maybe a couple months with this one, because with this one I spoke to more people than I'd ever spoken with, because they would say, well, talk to so-and-so, see what they have to say. So it kind of kept getting extended. So I posted the article August of last year, so I probably worked on it a good part of the summer.
Wow, okay. So that's a lot of work into this one.
Yes.
Okay. And I have to ask you, just maybe to talk about your process a little bit. Is this a situation, being that you first learned about this disappearance? Of course, it's roughly 33 years old. Of course, it's 33 years old later this year, but over 32 years old. And is this a situation where you find out about a disappearance that catches your attention, you put it on a list to work on it somewhere down the road? What is your process when you hear about a case, and whether you decide, when you're going to cover it, and if you can?
I would first just do an internet search, basically, because I don't really want to write an article if I can't add anything to it. If the only thing I can find online is what was in, say, the Unsolved Mysteries segment, then I'm not going to bother, because a lot of people do that. They just kind of rehash the segment, and that's it. So a lot of it depends on if I can find family members, because as you know, sometimes I'll send emails and messages, and I don't get a response.
Sure. It happens.
Not 100%. It's just, you have to get lucky sometimes.
Yeah. Okay.
And sometimes people just don't want to drudge it back up. It's too painful.
Yeah, that's true. We run into the same things here at Unfound. Totally true. And one more point just about your work process and maybe how it relates to Christi's disappearance. How many disappearances would you say that you're working on at one time?
Oh, I just work on one at a time. I like to.
Okay.
It takes a lot of time to research. And then as I'm writing it, I'm always, of course, thinking about the next one that I want to write about.
Okay. So it's not, I guess it would be in contrast to, well, I'm going to devote a few days to Christi's disappearance, and then I'm going to work on this one and then come back to it. So what you're saying is when you start on, you decide, okay, this is the next case I'm going to write about, that you work on that until it becomes, it is posted on your site, and then you move on to the next one.
Yeah, because I work, so my time's limited, so I like to just focus on one at a time.
Great. All right. I think that helps the listeners understand how you go about doing this, and writing for on your very popular blog, and hopefully that can give some insight to other people who may be thinking about doing the same thing, that you go about it one case at a time. All right. Interesting. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to Christi herself. What have you learned about her? Of course, you did not know her. I did not know her. What have you learned about her? Maybe let's start here. What is her maiden name?
It was Williams.
Christi Williams. Okay. All right. Because Nichols is her married name, and that was the last name of her husband, Mark, that we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So that was her maiden name. Okay. So what have you learned about her? Family, interests, education, etc.
Like I said, I've talked to her mother, and she said that Christi was just very smart, but she was very timid and just a soft-hearted girl. She was loyal to her friends, that she always wanted to be a mother. She loved animals, and she graduated high school. She did do a semester of college, but then she kind of wanted a little bit more freedom, so she moved in with her grandmother, who was Violet Williams, and she lived in Gothenburg. So that's how Christi got to Gothenburg.
Okay.
And we're not really sure exactly how she met Mark Nichols, but, he lived there too, and it's only like a small town of, 3,000 or so. Mm-hmm. So they met somehow in Gothenburg, got married not long after. Christi was 19 when she got married to Mark. And then shortly after that, they had their first child together.
Yeah, and we have to remember that she was only 22 years old when she disappeared on December 11th, 1987. Do you happen to know how old Mark was at the time that they got married? How much older was he?
Not positive, but I think he was just a couple of years older than Christi.
Okay. All right. So we're not sure exactly how they met. Like you said, though, small town, could have easily just run into each other somehow.
Yeah, hanging out at the same places.
Okay, yeah, sure. And did she have a job at the time before she got married, or while she was married? Was she working anywhere?
Yeah, I think she had a few jobs, like cashier, and worked at a restaurant, things like that, just whatever she could get to earn some money and help out.
Okay. So we don't know how Mark and she met. What have you been told about their relationship? We'll get into their children here in a moment, but what have you been told about their relationship? How did people portray it? Of course, we have to realize that I don't think you spoke to anybody on Mark's side, so we just have to remember that. But you've talked to people who knew Christi. What did she say? What did they see?
Well, they thought that he was controlling, like her brother would say at family gatherings and stuff. It was kind of like, okay, it's time to go, and just kind of controlling. Mm-hmm. But no one ever saw them have fights or physical fights. That was more, I think, a private thing. But they weren't fond of Mark. Christi's family wasn't from the beginning. Mm-hmm.
Do you know over the time that they were married, were there any 911 calls, any, cops ever have to show up and kind of separate them? Ever been told anything like that?
I don't know that they've ever called the police, but I do know that Christi had a few ER visits, and she had one just like 10 days before she went missing.
Okay. And do you know the injuries that she had? Did her friends or family see these injuries?
They saw injuries on her, but this particular time, I believe, and I'm not sure if she confessed this to the ER doctor, but her thumb had been bent back severely. And I believe she went in for an x-ray, and Mark was out in the hallway, so I'm not sure exactly what story Christi gave them about how it happened, but on the Unsolved Mysteries segment, Mark said that Christi wanted to leave and go out, and he didn't want her to. He claimed that Christi burned his neck with the cigarette, and he pushed her onto the bed, and her thumb bent up underneath her. That's how he claimed the injury happened.
Okay. Being that maybe some people suspected that this was a turbulent relationship, did anybody ever try to talk to her about Mark? Hey, Christi,
Well,
what's going on here?
Connie said that she would see bruises on Christi, and she said you could tell that they were handprints. And she would ask Christi, Christi would say, no, it's fine. And Connie honestly thinks the reason that Christi didn't confide in them was Christi had a stepfather named Greg that she had a good relationship with. And Connie said that Christi would have been scared what Greg would have done to Mark. So she just kept it quiet, what was happening, until she did start to confide. I believe she even told the grandmother at one point about this. According to Connie, she told Violet Williams a little bit about the abuse, and she was more like, well, you just need to stay and work things out. That was what Christi was being told by a few people.
Okay. So we have this turbulent relationship going on. Not long before she disappeared, she even had to go to the ER. Of course, there was a story. Mark seemingly has some sort of story, regarding how that happened, but I guess not a lot of people believe that. But they did have some children. How many children did they have? How old were they at the time of Christi's disappearance? What do you think the situation was with the parenting?
They had 2 children. Lindsay turned 3 just a couple weeks after Christi disappeared, and then they had a son, Preston, and I believe he was 1.5 to 2 years old when Christi went missing.
Okay. And we have to remember they were only married a few years, so it seems that they had kids very quickly.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And so they were married for about 3 years. The children, anybody in your conversations with anybody in Christi's family, what kind of parent was Mark?
I hadn't really heard anything about Mark's parenting. I mean, Christi was completely devoted to her children. They were her pride and joy. And I did recently find out about some child abuse allegations against Mark that were made by Christi just a couple of days before all of this started to unfold. Right,
and we will get into that a little bit later after we explain to the listeners, all the details of the disappearance, so we can kind of put that on a little bit of a timeline so they can understand it. So they have these 2 children and kind of a rocky relationship. Sounds like it could have been abusive, bruises, etc. So let's move on to this, and maybe this shouldn't maybe be a surprise to the listeners, being that we just covered what we've covered. But we're going to talk about just the days and weeks before. Is there proof that Christi might have been thinking about getting a divorce?
Yes. She had told her mother that she was going to see an attorney. And I've spoken with Christi's cousin, Debbie. They were pretty close before Christi went missing. And they met up around Thanksgiving weekend. So this would just be, a few weeks before she went missing. And Christi was talking to her about the abuse and even recounted to her a story that Debbie was completely shocked by. And she basically said, well, if Lindsay came down the stairs and saw Mark stabbing a knife beside me into the wall, do you think she would remember something like that? And Debbie said Christi wasn't even concerned about herself. She was more worried that that's something that Lindsay would remember. Lindsay was not even 3 yet. And she had told Debbie that she was going to get a divorce, that she wanted to go to an out-of-town attorney so Mark would not find out, and said that Christi lifted her shirt and there was this massive bruise that it just covered her entire side.
Oh, my. Okay. Did she say how that happened?
She just said they'd gotten into it and Mark had thrown her around.
Yeah, that sounds a little more serious than a turned-back thumb, Heather.
Yeah.
Okay. I would have been interested to hear Mark's explanation for that. Do you know if Mark ever gave an explanation for that particular bruise?
No. I mean, he just went on the segment to tell everybody that he was not a violent person, that everyone thinks that he is.
Okay.
But like I said, a lot of people saw the bruises.
Okay. So Christi did end up finding a divorce lawyer out of town?
Yes, she went to Kozad, Nebraska. It's only about 10 miles away. And it was Claude Barrackman she went to see.
Okay.
And this was only a couple of days before she went missing. And he'd mentioned in the UN segment how she was just so terrified. And she didn't have any money, but he had seen the bruises for himself. So he had told her that they would go ahead and proceed with everything. He was very kind to her, very concerned about her. And when she left, she'd made an appointment to come back the next week. And when she mentioned to him some of the abuse allegations, he phoned Gothenburg. He may have phoned the county attorney first, but of course, the Gothenburg Police Department, they were alerted of the situation.
Oh yeah, and we're going to talk about them in a second because the listeners will surely be interested to hear the connection between the police chief and Mark. But I do want to ask you something regarding the lawyer, though, and it's in the outline here, so you know it's coming. You know, being that the lawyer would be saying these things after discussions with Christi, do you think those things would not be privileged? He's talking so openly about, what she was telling him.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but my theory would be that he probably really thought Christi was in harm's way, and he thought maybe sharing what he knew would help to find her.
Okay. All right, that's interesting. I'm not a lawyer, but all I know about lawyers is from Law and Order. But it does seem interesting to me that he'd be very vocal about some of the things she was telling him. Maybe he was just thinking, well, maybe she's deceased anyway, so maybe privilege doesn't extend into the afterlife. I'm really not sure. But we'll talk a little bit more about the lawyer later. Maybe we can approach that subject again later in this discussion. But she did get a lawyer. Did the lawyer happen to say in these conversations how far along this was? I mean, had she served Mark with papers yet? Do you know?
No, I believe this was just their initial meeting.
Okay.
And so I'm sure he hadn't been served yet or anything.
Okay, so very, very early on.
But it appears, of course, that Mark was let know pretty quickly about her visit with the lawyer.
Okay. Any idea how Mark would have found out that she was visiting a lawyer? Do you think that she told him, or what do you think?
No, the police chief, Bob Shackleton of Gothenburg, was a longtime friend of the Nichols. Him, as well as the state patrol, Marlon Cookshausen, and Mark's father, Connie was told, bowled on the same bowling team for over 20 years. So it appears they were longtime friends.
Okay.
And we think that that Mark was given a heads up, because if the PD was, made aware of these allegations of abuse, perhaps Mark was told. Okay.
Yeah, let's move on to Bob Shackleton. He's the police chief for Gothenburg, Nebraska.
Yes.
Okay. Friends with the Nichols family, is this just because it's such a small town, or does it go deeper than that? Were you able to determine that?
I think it's just a small town, and, the bowling league and everything. Everyone knew everyone there.
Okay. All right. And so you think that he was kind of I guess we might call a pipeline back to Mark. If he heard anything, it'd go right back to Mark?
Yes, and he didn't treat Christi well at all, the police chief.
Okay. All right, let's just go over that divorce lawyer story again, being that we now established who Bob Shackleton is. He's the police chief. The divorce lawyer called Gothenburg police about what Christi had told him?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, Connie thinks the first person he called would be the Dawson County attorney. but then I'm sure in turn he called the PD or the county attorney did, so they could, look into it.
Right.
But then I was going to talk about later on that day, Christi, after the meeting, she went to work, and she got off work late at night. Mark's parents were babysitting the two children, and when she got there, Mark told her she wasn't allowed to take the children because he had found out and she went to the divorce attorney earlier that day.
And the belief is that that Mark found out about it from Bob Shackleton, the police chief, because the lawyer called the police department.
Yeah, and he'd found out that Christi had made these allegations about abuse, and he was furious. Christi was completely panicked at the thought of not being able to get her children and bring them home, and she even called the police. She was still hoping the police would help her, and Bob Shackleton basically said that Mark had a right to withhold him, told Christi to go home, and then if she came back, she'd be arrested.
So when you say go home, were Christi and Mark not living together at that time? Maybe you can explain that. Go home.
Oh, no, the kids were at the Nichols, Mark's parents' house.
Oh, okay.
They were babysitting that night,
Okay.
And she came to pick them up like she would normally do.
And they wouldn't give them up?
No, and I believe Mark appeared at some point, and that's how she knew that he had found out, because Christi went and called her mother that night. She was panicked.
Yeah.
And Connie said that we can get over there. Connie lived about 100 miles away, I believe, and said, we'll come right over. And Christi said no. She didn't want him to. She didn't really want her stepfather and Mark to have a scene. So she declined that night for her mom to come over.
What was the eventual resolution to that, Heather? If she went to pick her kids up, Mark's parents wouldn't allow her to take them. What was the eventual resolution to that predicament? Do you know?
Well, the next morning, I'm not sure whether Mark came to the house or how it happened, but Mark had this list of demands that Christi had to agree to get her kids back. And she wasn't able to go out of town. She wasn't able to visit her mother. He said that he had taken her name off of all of their bank accounts, so she wouldn't have any access to money. And she had to stop the divorce proceeding. And also, I believe that was all. I was trying to think of all the conditions.
Okay, so.
And, of course, Christi had, to his face, she'd agreed to all of these conditions because she just wanted her children back.
Yes. Yep.
And so they all returned that day together, and Christi had made an appointment with an abuse counselor. Betty Koch was her name. And she went ahead and kept her appointment. It was, the day after the lawyer. So, Mark thought that Christi had agreed to all of his demands and it was going to be fine. This was all going to go away. And then Betty and Christi meet, of all places, in Bob Shackleton's office in Gothenburg. Which I don't know why they did that. I mean, Connie just said, well, maybe they thought it was a safe place because it was the police department. And, I mean, we don't know for a fact, but it seems pretty obvious that Mark was probably given a heads up, and he knew that Christi hadn't given up the desire to end the marriage and to leave.
Wouldn't an abuse counselor have his or her own office or something where Christi could have just said?
And I don't know whether she was somewhere else in the county and traveled in. I'm not sure if her, she just was in Gothenburg. She could have floated around a bit. But, yeah, we really don't know why they met there. But Connie did talk to Betty after the fact, the abuse counselor. She really wasn't able to go into a lot of detail because, like you said, it was privilege. But, she did believe that Christi was abused, and she just wanted to get her out of the situation. And, in fact, she wanted to have her leave that night with the kids. And Christi said no. She said, I'll come back tomorrow with the kids. and they would get him to a safe house. But Christi wouldn't be around in the morning.
Mm-hmm. That is, Heather, you've covered a lot of disappearances, as you know I have as well. That is one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. An abuse counselor meets with a battered woman at a police department's office, and that's the first part of it. And are you saying then that Christi wasn't aware that Bob Shackleton and Mark were friends? You know, would she not suspect that maybe?
I'm sure she was aware.
Please.
Well, I mean, I don't know about friends, but to backtrack a little bit, the day that Mark withheld the kids from her, they said that the police chief had already harassed her a couple of times before that day. He had met her, ran into her at the convenience store, and even on the street, and he actually confessed this to Connie, that he had just told her that she needed to straighten up and get this thing worked out with Mark. And then, of course, the third time that day was when he told her to go home and leave her kids there or she'd be arrested.
And then she still agreed to meet this counselor at this guy's office at the department.
Yeah.
That's I have to admit, that's a little hard to understand. It just
yeah, you'd like to kind of know what went through her mind. But I mean, her main focus was just getting out of the marriage, so I guess she just kind of did what she needed to do, she thought.
What's her mother say about this? Does she not also think it's a little strange about the meeting where they did? And I mean, if it was some, moral, ethical police chief, then I get it. But it was already established that this guy, was biased toward Mark. Has Connie, her mother, been able to explain any of this at all?
Well, no, but I mean, we're looking at it after she went missing. I don't think they ever dreamed she'd go missing. But Connie didn't really have an answer. She just said, I just figured they probably thought it was a safe place since it was a police department, which you would hope would be a safe place.
Yeah, you'd think. I guess what I'm saying is I think you acknowledge this as well, is that there just seemed to be some things here going on before this meeting with the council that shows that the police department was at least a little crooked.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, Connie blames the police chief and this Cookshausen state trooper almost as much as she blames Mark.
Right. Okay. And we're going to talk about and Bob is not the only Shackleton that is involved in this, right? His wife was an ER doctor, and she just happened to be the doctor that saw Christi when she had the big bruise, right?
Yeah, she was the one interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries. She was married to the police chief, and I don't see any allegations of anything shady. It just kind of goes to the whole little tight-knit community.
Yeah.
Where Christi couldn't turn around without someone reporting her activity back to Mark.
That is wow. And so, the chief's wife is seeing Christi, and then of course Mark knows that she's at the hospital and everybody's seeing this bruise because probably the wife tells her husband and gets back to Mark, and oh wow, it just feels like Christi was somewhat surrounded.
Yeah, and Christi was going about everything the right way. She was doing what you're supposed to do to get out of a bad marriage.
One more thing before we get to the evening of December 10th. Is this counselor still alive? Have you tried to contact this counselor?
No, she's passed away. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I just went by what Connie did have a conversation with her.
Okay. So we have to remember this over 30 years ago. Let's move on to, I guess, what we could call the day of the disappearance. What do you understand about Christi and Mark's movements for that day?
So I believe that's the day that she met with the abuse counselor. But I'm not really sure how it happened, but then Mark wanted them to all go out together. The Unsolved Mystery segment says Christmas shopping, but I asked Connie why would Christi agree to this, but she thinks Christi was just trying to keep everything calm so she could leave. And I kind of think Mark was trying to put it out there that they were trying and they were getting along okay. because they took their kids and they went shopping. They went to Pizza Hut, I believe. And then they brought their kids back to their teenage babysitter that they had used, in the past. And then they went on to the bar where Christi had worked. And Mark's uncle owned it, by the way. So people were kind of surprised. Small town, everyone's business. And they knew that they weren't getting along. Even the babysitter mentioned. She was surprised that they'd went out. And, the uncle in the newspaper article said you could tell there was a lot of tension between them. But Mark kind of had a different spin in the interview. He said they kind of started to have fun at the bar, and they were playing pool. And I believe after they got done at the bar, they went to a convenience store because there was an account in a newspaper article that said Christi seemed a little bit scared. She would just kind of hang out by the cashier, and said Mark had bought some milk and some breakfast items, and they had left. And this was late, like 12:30 or 1 a.m. And that's the last time, as far as I know, Christi was ever seen at that convenience store.
Okay. So they went out, even though abusive relationship, they went out trying to have a good time, left the kids with a babysitter, and went to these places, and then seemingly went to this convenience store. And what happened after that? So eventually they come home, but what happens?
Well, the account from the babysitter, it was just a few little things, because Christi, would have, in the past, would have always come in to ask the babysitter how the kids were and everything. And the babysitter said, I never saw Christi. I only heard one car door. I heard one set of steps on the tile floor. And Connie also mentioned that it was really cold that night, and the babysitter was sitting not far from the front door. Now, Mark claims Christi went in quite a ways ahead of him, but she didn't feel any cold air blowing in until Mark entered. Just little things like that. Mark claims that she went ahead, went straight to the kids' room, and the babysitter she could not agree with that because she said, I never saw or heard Christi at all when they got back.
All right, so we have two different stories. Mark says that Christi was with him and did walk into the house when they got back that night. The babysitter says that's not possible. It was only Mark.
Yes.
Okay. Just some important questions before we move on. How long after Christi's disappearance was the babysitter asked about that night? Was it just a few days later, a week later? How long?
See, I can't be sure, but, Mark, reported her missing right away, so I would think shortly after they had talked to her.
Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to establish, it's not like the babysitter was suddenly asked about this like years later and her memory might be a little fuzzy or something like that.
No, and I tried to reach out to her. I talked to her sister, and she just really didn't want to talk because everything she remembered, is in the newspaper accounts on Unsolved Mysteries. She didn't really have anything to add. It was just a few minutes, that she was involved in this.
Okay. And the other question is, if the babysitter determined that Christi wasn't there, of course Mark said she was, but the babysitter didn't see her, did she not ask where Christi was before she left?
I don't believe she did. Another thing she mentioned was Christi would always pay her, and she would always pay her with a check, and Mark just came in and gave her some cash. So that was a little bit different, she'd mentioned, than usual.
Okay. Because I'm guessing what happened was that, Mark shows up there, like you said, pays the babysitter, and then the babysitter, I don't know what she was thinking at the time, why she didn't see Christi, but it didn't come to mind. But then later, when asked about it, of course, then she's thinking, oh yeah, Christi wasn't there. And I'm just thinking back in retrospect, if the babysitter was so used to seeing Christi, and Christi was the one that paid her, it would seem like a natural question to ask Mark, hey, where's Christi? But we don't know if that ever happened or not.
Yeah, I just kind of pictured it was really late at night, and she just wanted to get home, and she got paid, and she left.
Okay. All right, so babysitter leaves. Mark's there. Maybe Christi's there. Maybe she isn't. The kids are there. We go on to the next day. What happens?
So the next morning, Connie said it was around 8 o'clock because she had a field trip, so she was a bus driver. She called Christi because she knew, all the tensions that they were having. And Mark answered, and he said that Christi was in bed and that he would have Christi call her when she woke up. And, of course, she was a little skeptical since everything that had went down.
Yeah.
So she had a friend that worked in social services, and she called her and said, will you call Mark and Christi and ask for Christi? But just a few minutes later, this friend called Mark, and he said that Christi was uptown, I guess running errands or something. So right away, his stories weren't matching up. And the next thing we know that happened, I think it was about 11:30, Mark gets the kids and puts them in the car and drives to Christi's grandma, Violet Williams, asks if she'll babysit the kids. And one account in the newspaper, Mark said he was sobbing and he was so upset, but the grandmother said no, he wasn't crying at all. And he was going to go drive around and look for Christi. And he also mentioned something about cleaning out his car. But as far as I know, nobody reported seeing Mark these few hours that he mysteriously left that morning. I do think he did try to first thing go report Christi missing at the Gothenburg PD.
Mm-hmm.
And they told him he couldn't because she'd only been gone a couple of hours. But his story was always, well, she's left and she's abandoned the kids.
So he didn't drop the kids off at his parents or somebody in his family. He actually went to somebody in Christi's family to drop the kids off.
Yeah.
And that was
telling.
And that was, just to be clear,
he was telling her that Christi was gone. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So once again, though, it wasn't Connie who got the kids. It was Connie's mother. So Christi's grandmother.
It was Christi's birth father's mother, but Connie lived, like 100 miles away, and Violet did live in town.
Okay.
But he said he didn't tell Connie that she was missing because he didn't want to worry her. That's why he lied to her when she phoned that morning.
And if you could restate again, when he dropped the kids off at this grandmother's, what was his reason for doing so? What did he say?
Well, he mentioned he cleaned out the car, but he was going to go try to find Christi. And he said he just spent a couple of hours driving around places where she might be. But I do think one of his first stops was the Gothenburg PD. Of course, I don't know what actually went down there.
Yeah.
But they told him he couldn't report her missing. It hadn't been long enough.
So when he said drop the kids off, he just said, I'm going to look for Christi. He didn't say why he was looking for Christi or where he thought she went at all.
No, he didn't. According to Violet, he didn't really seem panicked. And he said, it was the only thing that was odd was they would usually call ahead, see if she babysit. But this was just he just kind of dropped them off at her house with no warning.
Did Mark have any family living in Gothenburg?
His parents lived there. He has a few siblings. I'm not positive if they were living there at the time. But yes, definitely his parents had lived there for many years. Okay.
You have any reason why my natural inclination, if a parent of children has their parents in town, they'd usually drop the kids off with their parents. Can you think of any reason why he didn't drop the kids off with anybody in his family? Has that ever occurred to you?
The only thing I can think of is he wanted to start the story that Christi left. So, of course, he wants her family to know that.
Mm-hmm.
And here's evidence he drops his kids off so he can go look for his missing wife.
Yeah, and okay, that's a pretty good explanation. I buy that, Heather. Okay, that's good. Yeah. All right, so drops it off at the grandmother's place. He goes, and how long is he gone before he comes back?
I think it just had a few hours.
Just a few hours.
And I'm not sure what happened the rest of the day, but I believe either that day or the next day, Mark actually moved out of the house with his children and moved into his parents' house. Right.
I certainly want to talk about that. All right. So he does this on, I guess this would be the next day. And are we considering that day December 11th? Is that right, Heather? This day that he dropped the kids off?
Well, it might be the 12th because she went missing, basically overnight.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really positive,
okay.
But it could very well be the 12th when it all came out.
Okay, I will make sure when everybody hears that we have a clear understanding of that, because I will admit I did not check the calendar to see what day December 10th, December 11th, December 12th was. Okay, that's fine. All right, so the next day, the night after they went out and went to shoot pool, is the day that he says that somehow Christi left. He drops kids off at the with her grandmothers, goes away for a couple hours, comes back, and picks them up. You said that he tried to get a police report done regarding Christi going missing, but it was just a few hours. Was he eventually successful in doing that, or did somebody else have to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure whether he tried to do it again, but, the police were a little bit involved at that point, as much as Gothenburg ever got involved.
Mm-hmm. Do you know who eventually did file the official missing persons report?
No, I do not.
Okay. Well, at some point it was found. When does it become obvious to people in Christi's family that, other than Mark just saying he's going to look for her, when does it become obvious to them that Christi is certainly missing?
If I recall, I believe the next day, Connie and her husband did drive to Gothenburg because they knew right away with everything that had happened that she didn't just decide to leave in the middle of the night, and abandon and leave all of her belongings behind. I might add as well. Okay. And in fact, when Mark said she was missing, he said she took a suitcase and he detailed all the clothing that was missing from her closet.
Okay.
And that will come into play a little bit later.
Yeah, it will. Yes, it will. When Connie and I guess her husband, would the husband also be Christi's father? Are they still married?
No, it was her stepfather.
Right.
His name was Greg. Yeah.
All right. Connie and Greg get to Gothenburg. They track down Mark. How did those conversations go?
All she said is he just kept saying that she abandoned the children. That's just what he kept saying over and over. There wasn't any kind of concern for what had happened to her. She just left the children. And when Connie talked to the police department, that's all they told her as well. She left the children.
She left. That was it.
Yeah.
Did Mark...
That's how they treated the case.
Okay. Did Mark ever get more explicit? Being that, he says that they came home together. The babysitter just didn't happen to see Christi when they got home. Does he say that, she just got up and got in somebody's car? Did she walk down the road? Did she get a taxi? I mean, how in detail did he get with his story of how she left?
He didn't really have any details. I mean, according to him, they went to bed that night together, and when he woke up, she was gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's in Unfound terms, this is kind of known as the Rosemary Rapp defense, which exactly what happened in her case, which I think is very similar to Christi's. That's what her husband claims. I woke up the next day and she was gone, and I just don't know what happened. Okay, so that's...
the cars were still there, too. She didn't leave in a car, didn't take hardly any of her belongings.
Okay, just like you said, there was a suitcase with some clothes missing.
Yeah.
But somehow he knew his entire wife's wardrobe to tell her parents, or at least her mother and her stepfather, what she took, even though he didn't see her take the stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Any searches done around the area? What went on from there, the way you understand it?
Yeah, there were definitely a lot of searches, and I will note that Mark or his family never participated in any of the searches. But of course, the searches didn't find anything.
Okay. Do you know how they even would have picked out any areas to even even look, being that he says, well, she just picked up and left.
I do know that at one point, I don't know how much longer it was, but the Nichols had a cabin in Brady, Nebraska, and they did search that area. I think it was probably after the state police got called in. But
okay.
Because at one point, Lindsay had said, Daddy put Mommy in the green water. Now, bear in mind, Lindsay was very young, and they didn't know whether to take that serious. They didn't even know that she knew what the color green was, honestly.
Right.
So, I mean, but they did search the area.
Okay. Now, the police, we've already talked about Bob Shackleton, him having close relationship with Mark and Mark's family, kind of being a pipeline back to him. As you stated, Connie herself puts a lot of blame on Shackleton, and then the state trooper who we'll eventually talk about in a little more detail. Did the police get involved in this or not? Could they be trusted? How did Connie feel about that, being that she knew that that Shackleton was connected to Mark anyway?
Well, she was just so frustrated. She would call him literally every day. And she said the only thing they did was what I told them to do. Like, she would say, did you check the dump? And they'd say, well, that's a dirty job. And she said, well, it's your job. So it seems like if she would persist about things, they would do a little bit of investigating. So after about 5 weeks of this, they just got so frustrated that they hired a PI to look into Christi's case.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was Dennis Whalen was his name. And then, so he actually, did the real investigating, and he actually got access to their house, and he looked around, and in their bedroom there was a laundry basket. Well, he moved the basket, and there's this basketball-sized area of blood. And, of course, they were shocked, and because supposedly Gothenburg PD had already searched the house, and Shackleton just said, well, he didn't bother moving the laundry basket. So when the blood was found, that's when they called in the Nebraska State Police.
Okay.
And Connie believes if they would have gotten the case right away, that they would have solved the case.
I want to come back to this. I'm just going to try to follow the outline we're here. Certainly, I want to come back. We're going to have a much deeper discussion about the blood and a couple of those issues you just brought up. I do want to move on to this, the note. This was good, being that we've talked about the searches and everything. When did this note pop up? Where was it found? When? What did it say?
Oh, the note that Christi wrote?
Yes. Allegedly wrote, yes.
I believe it was not long after, because it was found under the seat of the car that she drove. And it was rumored around town that Christi was dating someone. And I'll go ahead and I'll just read the note. It says, I want you to know I will probably be leaving after Christmas, and I will try not to see or talk to you until then. It will all work out somehow. I'm really sorry. So that, I'm not positive if they checked. They actually never even showed Connie the note, which you think they would, just to see if it was her handwriting.
Yeah.
But, I mean, when I talked to her cousin Debbie, she thinks that it probably was Christi's handwriting from what she remembers. But Connie kind of wonders if maybe it was placed there, to kind of help Mark's story. Like maybe he found it and maybe put it under the seat. But I did ask around, and there was someone who they thought Christi was dating, and through Debbie, he actually agreed to speak with me, and of course I told him I would keep his name out of it. But he really didn't have much to say. He did say that him and Christi had like a one-time fling, and it was a couple of weeks before she went missing. But he said that he felt guilty about it because he had known the Nichols for many years. And he said that was pretty much it. So I'm not sure whether the letter was about him, or whether he was kind of downplaying his involvement with Christi, or what.
To this day, are you saying that all these years later, the family still hasn't seen this note? There's no picture of it. They've never even been shown it. Does it even still exist?
I don't know. I had never even heard about it until I found an old newspaper article, and it actually, quoted the notes. I mean, they had been told about it back then, but yeah, Connie said I was never shown the note.
So, conceivably, I'm not saying this happened, but conceivably, Mark could have written it. Anybody could have written it.
Yeah, because I don't know for sure if it was her handwriting or not.
Or it could have been typed, for all we know.
Yeah.
Could have been typed, which means seriously anybody could have done it. And it was found under the seat of her car.
Yes.
Who found it? Do you know?
And no, it didn't really say. And I mean, it would even make sense what she said, because if she was, going to be leaving Mark, and then after Christmas things would die down, that would make sense that she would be telling him that, because I won't be around until for a few weeks.
I agree with you. I'm just wondering why it was found underneath the seat of the car. Why would that not just be a note that wasn't found on the kitchen table?
Yeah, because, I mean, conceivably, her purse was left behind. She could have had it in her purse. Somebody could have found, Mark could have found it, put it under the seat.
I mean, because certainly, obviously, we both have to recognize, even though, as listeners can tell, we're very suspicious of Mark, that note would certainly take suspicion away from him. If it looked like...
it would bolster his story.
Yeah, it certainly would. And so it's interesting to me...
But if she was going...
Please.
But if she was going to abandon her children, she wouldn't have bothered going to the divorce lawyer and the abuse counselor. She would have just left.
Yeah. Yep, not sure what to make of that note. Of course, until we see it, until somebody can really analyze it, and I'm hoping, even though we have some concerns about the police department, I'm hoping that they have that note somewhere. Hopefully, but I don't know what the possibility of that is. I'm not too hopeful, unfortunately, but without seeing the note, without it analyzing it, comparing it to any handwriting that the family may still have all these years later, this note could be anything. It really, it could be Christi wrote it, Mark wrote it, anybody wrote it. Did anybody, this other man that she had this fling with not long before she disappeared, do you know if he ever offered up his own theory as to what happened to her?
No, I don't. And I believe the only people that spoke with him was the state police. He'd only been spoken to one time. And so I don't really think he was on anyone's radar about her disappearance. By all accounts, he was a very nice guy, and I think Christi was just, in a bad situation, and he was kind.
Okay. All right, so we have this note, not sure what to make of that, found underneath of the seat of her car at some point. I'm guessing somebody was cleaning it out or something and stumbled upon it. Then we have this other guy, and that could lend credence to the note, but we just don't know who wrote the note. I think that Mark and others would want us to believe that Christi wrote it, but there's no proof of that. Let's move on to this. You've already mentioned this before. Now we're going to talk about it a little more in depth. Mark moved out. When did he move out? I mean, did he move everything out or just his clothes? What was the situation?
It was either the day that she went missing or the next day, but him and his children all moved in with the Mark's parents, and just shortly after, even according to the Unsolved Mysteries segment, he bagged up all of her clothing. The family said he forged her name on the cars and sold the 2 family cars. And there's a theory, Connie has a theory I can tell you about later about why he moved in with his parents so quickly.
Yeah, we're going to, as listeners know, I think by this time, when I have a blogger on, like when Anthony has been on here before, he's been on the program 3 times, we do a little bit more theorizing than we usually do, that I would ever do with, family members. So we will certainly do a little bit of that before this is all over. But he moved out. and took essentially everything with him, right? I mean, with no plans to ever move back into that house where they were living.
Yeah, and it's kind of inexplicable why he would do that.
Yeah.
I mean,
so they were renting that house?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Now, what you've also written about in your blog regarding Christi's disappearance is that what went down with the children. It seems like they became hot potato, going back and forth before something was resolved.
Yeah, it's pretty complex, but of course, Christi's parents wanted to keep seeing them, and Mark was just really fought them every step of the way. And at some point, they were awarded custody for a while, and Mark would be able to visit them. And he would phone in and talk to them. And there was times when Lindsay was difficult to understand, and Mark would get stressed out. So Connie started to record the tape, the conversations, she said, as a way to help out, to kind of translate what Lindsay was saying. And just Mark being difficult, when he found out that she had recorded the phone calls, he files a lawsuit for $10,000 against her for recording them without his knowledge, which was, of course, baseless, but they had to go to court, several times before it was dismissed by the judge, because there was no basis to it. She was doing it to be a help. And so at some point, though, the children did become wards of the state, and Christi's parents got visitation, and so did Mark and his parents. And then I believe for a while custody was awarded to Mark's parents, and of course Mark lived there, so it was basically like he had him back. And it just got to the point where, they seemed to think that Mark was guilty, the officials, but they couldn't keep the kids away if Mark hadn't been charged with anything.
Right.
So then they just pretty much had to return him to Mark.
Okay.
And Christi's parents did get visitation, but Mark would make it very difficult. He would move, or he would move just across the state line where Connie said the order wasn't valid. And eventually Mark got married for the third time, and that's when he told them, the kids have a mom now, they don't need to see you anymore. So that's pretty much the last, time they got to see him.
Wow. Okay. Now, you already talked about being that he moved out so quickly with the kids, moved out, never to go back. You'd mentioned that sometime after he moved out, he and the kids moved out, that this private investigator was able to go in there. Please say again what the private investigator found. I should maybe ask you this first, but when the private investigator went to look at the house, had somebody already else moved in, or what was the situation?
See, I don't believe anyone else had. I think it had only been about 5 weeks since she'd been missing. So as far as I know, nobody lived there.
Okay.
If everything was still in place, I believe, when Mark and Christi lived there.
Okay. All right, so the private investigator, I guess he gets permission from the homeowner, the landowner, to go in there. He goes in there, and please state again what he found. He found this puddle of blood, splotch of blood. How big was it? Where was it?
Well, it was in their bedroom, and there was a laundry basket. So he moved it, and the newspaper article said it was the size of a basketball area of blood. It had soaked down through to the wood, so it was a significant amount of blood. And of course, they were surprised, and when Connie confronted Gothenburg PD about, why didn't you find it when you looked at the house? Mm-hmm. And Shackleton just said, well, he didn't move the laundry basket. So they did cut it down for testing, because when Mark heard about it, he actually said it was menstrual blood. That didn't make sense. It was way too much. And the lab, I'm not sure whether they were able to say it was positively Christi's back then, but they, of course, did say it was not menstrual blood. They could tell that.
Yeah, that is weird. That's Mark's explanation. I don't think that I don't know if that explanation would fly with anybody. It doesn't fly with me. But I can also, on the other hand, believe that the police went in there and didn't move a laundry basket. That wouldn't surprise me at all, given all of the stories that we've heard on Unfound over the last 3.5 years. Did the private investigator find anything else strange or unusual like that, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge. He has since passed away as well, so was not able to speak with him. But as soon as the blood was found, that's when they did call in the Nebraska State Police to take over the investigation.
Okay, let's move on to that. The state police, they get involved. Do things get any better?
I mean, they did a lot of work. The two involved were Terry Ahrens and Mel Messerschmidt, and Connie has nothing but great things to say about how hard they worked. And like I said, she believes they could have solved the case if they would have been given it right away. But so they did what they could. They did searches. I'm sure they investigated what they could. They're just, and at this point, they're just wanting a grand jury to hear this information. And and even Christi's lawyer, everyone just keeps pressing, let's get a grand jury together. Because everyone, was convinced Mark had something to do with it. But they never convened the grand jury. Connie said that there was no body. That was a big thing. And some of the things that the grand jury could see would not be able to be presented in the court. And she was, of course, a little bit concerned if he was charged and acquitted, then he'd never have to pay.
That's true. Being that the state police got involved so soon after this puddle of blood, I don't know exactly what to call it, in this house, did the state police go in there and look at it, and did they then go speak to Mark? I mean, how seriously did they take that?
Yeah, because he's the one, I'm sure the state police were the ones that talked to Mark about when he said it was menstrual blood. And they're the ones that they cut it out, the blood stain, and sent it off to the lab. So the state police were taking over after that.
And so because of that, but we don't know the results of that test all these years later of the state police trying to doing a good job. Nobody knows the result of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was human blood, but I'm just not sure back then. I don't figure they could do the DNA. I believe it was Christi's blood type, if I recall. But I don't know that it was like a DNA perfect match. This was, 1987. So.
Right. I'm just thinking that, the puddle was that big and it soaked in and they cut it out, you'd think that there would be enough to test all these years later. What do you think about that?
Yeah. And I don't even know if there's anything left. I don't know but yeah, definitely they could do a DNA test. Okay.
Did Connie get the idea from the state police, being that she had such nice things to say about them? Do you believe that the Nevada investigator, the state police investigators were leaning toward the idea that Mark did something to Christi?
Oh, yes. I mean, everyone I've talked to, without a doubt, thinks Mark's responsible. That's why it's such an aggravating case. No one has any other theory or thinks anything else happened to her, but that Mark killed her that night.
So, being that it took a while before the state police got involved, how much information is in the hands of Gothenburg police, and how much is now in the hands of the Nevada State Police? For example, being that we talked about the note, if it still exists, do you believe Gothenburg has it, or do you believe the state police has it? If you don't know, that's fine, but I think I have to ask that.
No, I don't know. I would hope the state police, because honestly, I don't know that Gothenburg would have kept anything. They kept telling Connie that she just ran off, so I don't know that they really gathered much evidence. And as soon as the blood stain, that's when state troopers were called in, so I would think they would have the carpet. Okay. I would hope.
How did have you ever learned how Bob Shackleton and Gothenburg police, and you mentioned this other person, who was this other investigator that you didn't have nice things to say about? What was his name?
It was Marlon Cookhausen, and he was from the Nebraska State Police, and they said he was friends with the Nichols family as well. So, you know, Connie said she was basically stonewalled by those two, and that's who got called in, you know, at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. And what you're
So
saying, this Cookhausen guy was
started recording their phone calls.
And what you're saying, this Cookhausen guy, eventually, when the state police got involved after the blood was found, he was not in charge of anything.
No, I believe it was Terry and Mel that were assigned the case then.
Okay. All right.
And not long after, Cookhausen was fired, from my understanding.
All right. Do you have any idea how Gothenburg police felt about the case being taken away from them?
You know, I asked Connie, and she really didn't know, but I'm sure they were a little put off because they didn't, according to them, they didn't think there was a crime involved. Mm-hmm. And I will say that I did try to call the Gothenburg PD at the very beginning of my research, and they were very dismissive when they said, there's no one here that can talk to you about the case. And that was it. And when I told her family, they were not a bit surprised. They are very uncooperative, even if the family would try to call in over the years. They were never helpful, even to this day.
Have you had a chance to talk to the Nebraska State Police?
No, I do plan on calling. There's a few names I've gotten that are currently looking into the case. I do plan on talking to them after the fact. But when I was doing my research, I really couldn't track down Mel Messerschmidt. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but I actually did phone Terry Ahrens, and because Connie suggested that I do so, and he told me that he just didn't want to talk about the case.
It was just a real short conversation like that?
Yes, very short, and I mean, it kind of surprised Connie, but Terry did have a very, very serious car accident not long after Christi went missing, so I mean, maybe his memory isn't very good around that time. Yeah,
it's possible. Okay, so the state police get involved. Sounds like there were a couple of good people working on it, but of course, as we know, this case disappearance is still unsolved over 32 years later. We'll talk about Mark a little bit more and what went on with him in a little bit. But March 1988, what happens next?
So at the Maxwell rest stop, which is only like 25 miles from Gothenburg, they actually find the suitcase that Christi supposedly took with her. And it didn't look like it had been weathered, like it had been out in the Nebraska winter. It looked like it had been carefully placed there, and her purse was there as well, and everything in the suitcase was exactly what Mark had described that she took with her.
Imagine that. So this is roughly 3 months after she disappeared, and it's found at this rest stop. How was it discovered? Just somebody just happened upon it and opened it up?
I believe a trucker at the rest stop found it. It was placed out in the open where it was easy to see.
I'm sure Connie found out about.
It hadn't been sitting there for 3 months.
Yeah, it hadn't been sitting there very long because it wasn't very weathered.
Yeah, it would have looked more weathered. Yeah, I don't mention.
Right, and probably a suitcase is not going to be perfectly waterproof. I'm sure it rained or snowed at least once in those 3 months, and I guess that wasn't a factor in this either. Couldn't have been there very long. What did the state police do with that? Did they collect it? Do they still have it?
Yeah, I really don't know what they currently have, but yeah, definitely they collected it because Terry Ahrens in the Unsolved Mysteries segment had kind of mentioned how it was surprising, that Mark knew exactly what was in there. And like if it were his wife, he wouldn't be able to tell you anything, that she had taken.
Would Mark have had easy access to this rest stop not far away?
Yeah, I'm sure he would have. It wasn't a very long drive.
Okay. So the suitcase is found. It's the exact suitcase Mark said. It's the exact stuff in it, even though, once again, he claims he did not see Christi leave, so it's a little hard to understand how he knew what would be in the suitcase. I don't think any man out there knows his wife's wardrobe exactly, but Mark seemed to have been able to have done that. Okay. Anything else? Any suitcase? Anything else discovered after? Of course, we mentioned the note, but anything that could be connected to her disappearance? Anything else just happened upon besides the suitcase, or was that the last of it?
No, that was the last bit of. That was a little bit of hope when they found it, but that was the last that I'm aware of.
Okay. We've talked about Bob Shackleton. How did he seems like a crooked guy. Sounds like a corrupt cop. I'm not saying necessarily he had anything to do with her disappearance, but being that it seems like he was being a pipeline back to Mark makes him corrupt in my mind. How did the police department come out of all of this? Was the police chief ever investigated for covering anything up? Did anybody question him, being so close to Mark and kind of running interference with him? Of course, the whole situation with the counselor. Anything like that at all?
As far as I know, he's never been held accountable for his actions as far as Christi's disappearance goes.
No.
Now, I've been told by several people from Gothenburg about he's a crooked guy, and I couldn't find any newspaper articles, but there was something where he got in trouble, and it was something about abandoned cars, and he would mess with the titles and was working, it's just, I can't really go into detail. I don't know it, but that was the consensus. Anybody you mention his name to that I talked to, oh yeah, he was a shady guy.
Yeah,
and
maybe
he has passed away as well.
Yeah, unfortunately. I could see a situation, maybe abandoned cars, maybe getting titles for them and selling them himself or something like that.
Yes, something like
that. Could be.
Yeah.
Okay. And Bob Shackleton, his wife was in the ER, just coincidentally. We've talked about this before, but just to remind everybody again, she was the doctor that looked at Christi when she went in with this big bruise.
She went in with her thumb injury, and that was about 10 days before she went missing.
The thumb injury. Okay, the thumb injury. All right, well, that's certainly a coincidence there as well, and I can see a situation where she would, of course, know Mark, and then, of course, the story about how Christi fell down on the bed or something and bent her thumb back, and how a doctor like that who has connections to Mark might just choose to believe that story. Okay. What about the other police officers in the Gothenburg Police Department? Kind of the same way, kind of the same types of people as Bob Shackleton. Have you ever gotten any feeling for that?
No, I've never heard anything about anyone besides Shackleton. I'm not sure there weren't a lot of police with it being such a small town, but he was the one that was. The family holds accountable, for not doing anything.
Sure. I guess what I'm saying is after the fact, being that they knew that Christi disappeared, none of them after the fact, maybe after Bob Shackleton wasn't the police chief anymore, none of them have ever come forward, none of them have ever gone to Connie and said, you know what, I think, Bob might have known more than he let on regarding Christi's disappearance, anything like that?
No, and someone that I talked to recently, and this is, I don't know that this is a fact, but he actually thinks the current police chief now at Gothenburg also knows Mark Nichols. So it seems like it's a never-ending cycle of people that, know Mark and his family.
What do you think? Is it just because it's a small town, Heather, or, do the Nichols have some sort of power in this town, or what's the overall family reputation?
Well,
maybe we haven't talked about that. Maybe we should right now.
I can't really say exactly why, but people would tell me that Lowell Nichols was not a nice guy. He seemed to be somewhat powerful, and I'm not sure why, but it was almost like, the Nichols family had a bad reputation, but was also well connected.
And Lowell is Mark's father?
Yes, and his parents have both since passed away as well.
Yeah. All right. So Bob Shackleton, doesn't sound like the greatest of reputations. It does seem like he was corrupt, crooked, but that does not necessarily mean anything to do with the disappearance. But it very well may be, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, that it could have led to Christi's disappearance, if you buy into the idea that Mark caused her disappearance. The divorce lawyer, we talked about him early on. Let's talk about him again. He has said a lot of things about Christi's disappearance, 18 pieces of evidence, etc. Why don't you go through that right now, Heather?
Well, I had found a mention of him in several articles, and it was, he actually had worked hard after Christi went missing because, he wanted her to have justice, and he was convinced that Mark had killed her. And just recently, Connie was going through some things, and she found a letter that he had sent to her as well as a few other people. And this was 2011, so Mr. Barrack was 78 years old, and I think he just really wanted to get this case resolved, because he passed away a couple years later. But he talks about, he recants what had happened, how upset that she was, Christi, and the bruises and everything, and that he had first initially called the Dawson County attorney and the Dawson County sheriff. So I don't know that he called Gothenburg. Maybe the Dawson County did. But then he talks about how, what happened when she went missing, and he does mention 18 pieces of evidence, and we're not sure how he knew about this. 19 pieces.
Okay.
Unless, since he's been on the case from the beginning, and this is a small town, maybe the state troopers felt comfortable in sharing with her attorney, some things. I'm not sure how he came to know this. And, but he says, at the time in their evidence, he says that they have one of their cars, and there's some plastic that he says has her blood smeared all over it. And so this must be the carpet we were talking about. He says the carpet next to her side of the waterbed soaked with her blood. And they also still have the suitcase with her clothing. So he says all of these things are at the Nebraska State Police North Platte Evidence Storage Space as of 2011. And he talks about how he pleaded for the grand jury and said people in the Gothenburg area were intimidated by Lowell Nichols, Mark's father, and most possible witnesses told law enforcement they didn't want to get involved. And they also spoke with Mark's first wife's mother.
I certainly want to talk about that too. Did this divorce lawyer ever list, I had it written down here as 18, but I guess it's 19 pieces of evidence. Did he ever delineate what those 19 pieces are?
He didn't list all of them, but in the letter he talks about, he mentions the vehicle, the plastic, the carpet, and the suitcase. So I'm not sure what the other items are, and I'm not sure whether the PI could have found other blood splatters in the house or not, but that's a possibility.
But Connie's never mentioned that to you, though.
No, and she's kind of mentioned with her age, she's forgotten a lot of things. She's kind of turned all the things she's amassed over to her son, so her son can kind of continue the fight.
Yeah. Any idea why the Nebraska State Police, would have all of these things, and how he would even know that they have them? Unless, did he have some sort of contact there, or what?
Yeah, I would think just that his position as an attorney, he was probably knew people, Nebraska State Police, and I can imagine him reaching out to them because they were brought in fairly early, 5 weeks later, Connie said. So I figured that he was working with them, and so they probably, they probably let him know some of the evidence. because he was really outspoken in the newspaper articles. I was a little bit surprised at how much work he had done after the fact.
What's his name again? I know you mentioned it earlier. Why don't you give his name again so everybody can know who he is, being that he was really trying to work on this and get it solved?
His name is Claude Barrack, and he has since passed away, but his son, Claude Barrack Jr., I did send an email to him back when I was researching, and he did say that he would look through his father's things to see if there was anything noteworthy, but then I never did hear back, so
okay.
There may not really be anything else out there.
So obviously, the divorce lawyer thought that Mark is the guilty party. I don't think that there's any doubt about that, even though he's not with us anymore. I think that we can certainly read his mind, and that's what he was thinking.
Yeah, he actually said in the segment that he had handled hundreds of divorces, but she was probably in the top 5 of just being so terrified.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is something else regarding going back to the night of the disappearance. There was allegedly a sighting of Mark, seemingly by himself. Why don't you tell the listeners about that?
So I talked to a man, and he was a teenager at the time, and he was just hanging out at the park, which was next to Mark and Christi's house. And it was, I'm not sure exactly, it was really late at night. And truck, and he was back there by it, and Mark sees this guy and makes eye contact, and Mark starts walking towards him, and he's yelling stuff. And I don't think this guy even knew what Mark was yelling, but it really kind of freaked him out. So as Mark starts walking towards him, yelling, this guy just hurry up and leave. So there was never really an encounter with him, but it was just a couple days later, he finds out that Christi went missing that night. You know, close to the time when he had that angry encounter somewhat with Mark. So that really freaked him out, really left a lasting impression.
How did you even track this guy down, Heather?
This person had contacted Corey, Christi's brother. So Corey had given me his information, and he agreed to talk to me. And he also did say, and this is just kind of vague, but he said that a few months later, Mark entered this place where this guy hung out all the time. Said Mark really just kind of gave him a death stare. It was he didn't know if Mark remembered him from that night or what, but you know, it's just something that he also told me that I thought I would share.
So what happened with this encounter? So he claims that he saw Mark by himself without Christi. What was Mark doing again?
He just said he was out by his pickup truck. And he did say that sometimes in town, if they would have like beer in their vehicle and they would leave it unlocked, sometimes people would take it out. So he didn't know whether there was something more, Mark was, worried that he was going to take something or what. But he did throw that in there, that sometimes that would happen.
So did this guy, who was a teenager at the time, did he run? Did Mark just turn around and go back the other way? What happened?
Yeah, I think he just walked away quickly, and Mark didn't continue to follow him.
Okay. All right. That's seemingly, I'm not. Once again, stories like this, I'm not sure what to make of them. People remembering specific nights. Are we sure this wasn't a few nights before or after, Christi disappeared and, but we have.
Yeah, he just told me a couple days later he saw that she went missing, and he kind of put two and two together, and was just more rattled that he had an encounter with him around the same time that she went missing.
Now, there's something about, and of course, remind the listeners that Mark moved out of the house the same day, or if not the next day, that Christi disappeared. He moved in with his parents, and we tend to hear this quite a bit, and I think that this kind of idea is getting a lot more credence, being that what we now know about Andrea Bowman's disappearance, in which, of course, everybody now believes that her adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, killed her, and after he's been charged with the murder of a woman in a different state, they went onto the property and found that remains were under, I think it ends up being the family out-of-ground pool, that there were remains found out under there that still have not been positively identified as Andrea's, but I think that's a pretty good guess of who those remains belong to. Something similar with Mark's parents' property. Why don't you tell the listeners about it?
So just a couple of days, literally after Christi went missing, they had a concrete pad poured for a garage that they were going to have. So, of course, the timing is suspect, and I've actually seen a picture of the house. It seems kind of an odd place to put a garage. They kind of put it next to a two-car garage. But, you know, and I talked to Debbie, Christi's cousin, and she talked to a few people that said, one guy that was there when it was being poured, he just said that the sand looked like it had been messed with. So they had to add some more sand to it, smooth it out, before the concrete was poured. But since the Nichols owned the property, there was apparently never any kind of search of the pad or what could be underneath the pad. I mean, still to this day, as far as I know. And I haven't contacted the owners, but I did find out who they are. I did pass that on to Christi's brother to kind of see how he wants to handle that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that if the Nichols do not own that property anymore, then I think that that is a worthwhile pursuit for sure. I don't think anybody has any doubt about that. Of course, we can even cite another disappearance that Unfound has covered, Zoe Campos, where remains were found on Carlos Rodriguez's property underneath the concrete pad. So there is some basis in other cases to think that this is a worthwhile pursuit.
And
for
that's
sure.
why Connie thinks that Mark moved into that house so quickly. To kind of keep an eye on things. That
would certainly make a lot of sense. And what it would also mean that his parents certainly knew what happened to Christi.
Yes,
you know, then
everyone I've talked to thinks his parents definitely had knowledge.
Yeah.
Possibly after the fact, but.
Okay. Yep, that's certainly a worthwhile pursuit. I hope you can make that happen this year somehow, Heather. You know, in working with the family there to get somebody out there. Of course, the first part is getting the homeowners' approval to do that. Hopefully, they understand the importance of doing something like that, and you know, all come down to cost. Who is going to pay for it to be done? That sounds like a lot of work. I am not in the construction business or anything like that, so I can't even say the amount of work and the cost. So
her brother had even mentioned he would like to go there with that ground penetrating radar, maybe to see if there was something underneath there.
Sure. Yep. That might be a less invasive way. However, I do know that ground penetrating radar can give a lot of false positives, making things look, like they really aren't underneath the ground. So, but it's probably a good start. You had mentioned to me you wanted something added to this outline for this interview. We can't forget that Mark actually was married before, even though he was only maybe 24, 25 already. He had gotten married even younger than that to another woman. What happened there?
I'm not really sure of the details, but I do know that she did leave Mark, and they had a son together, and she took the son with her, and to Connie's understanding, he signed away his rights. Because when she would speak with Christi, they never had any kind of contact with the son, and there were allegations of abuse as well. In fact, when Christi went missing, Connie reached out to Mark's first wife's mother, just to see if she could help or knew anything. And she was very protective of her daughter even then. And she said, they didn't want to get involved. And she said, if he's brought to trial, my daughter will not be testifying. that they would even get her out of the country if they had to.
Wow.
So definitely, and in fact, the lawyer in his letter mentions that Mark's first wife, was abused by Mark. So her own mother is telling the lawyer this.
Mm-hmm. So you're.
So I'm sorry. So that is a good theory as far as a motive as well, because Mark's first child was gone. Now the second wife was going to take his children as well.
Yeah, he saw the same thing happening again, and this time he decided, hey, I'm going to stop it.
And even the grandparents, I kind of get the impression that they were like that. We're not losing any more kids, any more grandchildren.
Sure. So in there, if anybody, once again, if you desire to believe that Mark caused Christi's disappearance, and you're wondering, well, what changed between, why was it that day and not some other day? Why was it that month, not some other month? Very well could be with the experience Mark had with his first wife and how he lost custody, and he was not going to let that happen again.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he knew that she was getting ready to flee because of all the appointments that she was going to. It was not going to be much longer.
Right, and on top of that, the abuse that Christi had mentioned.
Yes.
Okay. I have to ask this though, just to give Mark. I'm not here to be the lawyer for Mark, but just because I have to ask. Besides Christi's word, is there any proof that the children were ever abused by him?
Well, I did just recently find out that just a few days before Christi met with the lawyer, she filed a complaint, I'm assuming the Gothenburg Police Department, about Mark abusing the children. And I believe that, from what Connie remembers, he had thrown the daughter at some point. And she thinks that was pretty much, the final straw for Christi, because now the anger was, directed towards the children now as well. Because it was just a few days later, Connie believes that's when she made the appointment with the lawyer.
Okay. I have to ask that because, as you know, Heather, in many divorce proceedings, both parents say a lot of things. They're very desperate. They want to get custody. Of course, there's a lot of anger and everything else. And, people say a lot of things that even they would admit maybe somewhere down the road that they shouldn't, have said, and things they shouldn't have done. I'm just trying to analyze, are we sure this wasn't just something, to make her divorce case stronger?
I don't know. I mean, she recounted an incident that happened at the house. That's pretty much all I know. And I don't think anything ever happened with it because within a couple of days she was missing. So.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure that, we look at it, I look at it that way, and I know a lot of the listeners have been through their own divorces and they know how things can go. What is Mark doing these days, 32 years later?
I'm not really sure. I mean, he's got a Facebook page. According to that, he lives in Hastings, which isn't too far from Gothenburg. So he's still kind of around the area. He's been divorced 3 times, as far as I know, now.
Wow. Okay.
And every marriage, by the way, has had abuse allegations. I do know that.
But none of those the first wife isn't missing, none of the other relationships with women, none of them are missing, only Christi.
Right, and I was told by Connie, the third wife, there was an initial charge of abuse against Mark when her and Mark moved out of Nebraska. And she was in a safe house, and Connie said that with, I'm assuming Mark being connected, Mark actually got the phone number to this safe house and called her and was able to talk her into dropping the charges. So I don't think there's any charges on the record of abuse against him.
Do you think that he got this number through his police connections?
I do, because remember, he also had a state police trooper that he was chummy with.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Heather? Obviously, once again, you and I both have a lot of missing persons experience. Any insight into why some of these police officers are like this? Just they know that they know they shouldn't be giving phone numbers out and doing these things, but they do it anyway. And all this almost leads me to believe that this was more than just a friendship thing. It makes me think that that they might have been involved with Mark and other things illegal.
Yeah, and I don't know if they would believe Mark, but I could see Mark putting the spin, well, she's dating someone else, she's going to take my kids, and so they thought they were helping Mark out and didn't really have any compassion for Christi and what she could have been going through.
That could be, who knows what story he was telling them. She's making these allegations against me that aren't true and everything, but I've never been in that situation myself as an adult, but...
And it's scary, the mindset, because even the people that she were telling or thought she was being abused, they're just, oh, you just need to work it out, Christi.
Yeah. Crazy. All those people are insane. They're all wrong, yeah. and it's just crazy. Yeah, I can't, I have a lot of best friends, and some of them have gotten divorced and things, but I can tell you that my thing has always been stay out of it. Completely stay away. You don't know what goes on behind closed doors. You're friends with them, you like them, you want to hang out and everything, but when it comes to that stuff, sorry guys, but I'm just staying away. Or you're just going to have to figure it out. So obviously there are people out there that think differently than I do. So Mark's still around. I mean, what about Christi's kids? I mean, they're in their 30s now. What's going on with them?
I didn't speak with Preston. I don't think neither one of them live in Nebraska.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't really want to say too much about Lindsay, but she's very sweet. She contacted me after the article and really thanked me for doing it. And she doesn't really want to, be out there or say anything publicly, but of course she really misses her mother and she really wants to know what happened to her. And she thinks about her all the time.
If you can say, and you do not have any obligation to say, but I have to ask it, as you know, Heather, has she ever offered up her own belief of what happened to her mother?
No, she's in a kind of a tough position, and she just doesn't want to say anything, and I completely understand that.
She
does have a relationship with her father, I do know.
She does. Okay.
Yeah, she's still in contact with him.
Okay. Let's move on to maybe a little bit of theorizing, just throw around some ideas here, some questions and that I think have popped up during this interview. I know I don't usually do this with family members for obvious reasons, but being that you've written some theories and some ideas on your own blog, I just want to ask you a couple things so we can talk about them. If the babysitter did not see Christi come inside that night, and I think we're inclined to believe that Christi did not come inside that night, even though Mark said she did, can we explain the blood that was found in the house by the private investigator? Is there a way to explain that?
Well, I talked to Connie about this recently, and she kind of thinks that perhaps Mark beat Christi, but she wasn't dead. And she thinks that, maybe when the babysitter left, Mark carried Christi in later on the floor in the bedroom, and that maybe she even bled to death. Because that would explain why there was that much blood in there. And I'm sure, it would be easy enough with their children were very small and probably asleep. It would be very easy in the dark to just carry her in without anyone seeing that.
Okay.
And perhaps that's why he had to leave the next morning. She could have been in the trunk. And then he went to do something with her because it's kind of odd that he would have to go clean his car out the morning he thinks his wife is missing.
So what you're saying is I think a lot of people, maybe if they've heard about this disappearance and even before you wrote about it, maybe on the Charley Project or elsewhere, they could see a scenario where after they went out and had this good time, Mark did something to Christi and then disposed of her at that time, then came home by himself. But what you're saying is that there is a decent possibility, an alternate theory that is possible, is that when Mark got home, Christi was actually in the car but unconscious because something had already happened. But he had not disposed of her yet, but she was in the car.
Yes, that's a plausible theory, I believe, why that much blood was found there.
Okay. But, the issue is that we just really don't know when that blood was left there, do we? It may be Christi's blood, but maybe it's from something that happened a week ago. Maybe this was from a prior beating or something.
Yeah, and see, if the Gothenburg PD would have done their job, they would have found the blood right away.
Yeah.
And they probably could have been able to tell whether it was old or not.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is, you get to a point, obviously, if blood is deposited on the floor and you get to it within, a few hours, you can determine, when it was put there. But you get to it a week later, and then it's like, well, maybe, was there a week later, 5 days later? It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You have any insight on why? Of course, we know, Mark moves out very quickly. We've talked about that. Why he wouldn't try to, being that he knew eventually somebody else would be in that house, why he wouldn't try to clean that up? Any insight into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Mark has seemed to have gotten out of everything. I mean, even when he was younger, I was told stories of things that he did, and he never seemed to have to pay. I don't know whether it didn't occur to him or he just thought as long as he had access to that house, nobody would be going in there. He had the Gothenburg PD cooperating with him, and maybe he didn't know the PI was going to go in there and look around that day. That's what kind of started all this going.
Yeah, just to remind everyone, your estimation of how much later did the private investigator go in there? Did you say 5 weeks later?
Yeah, Connie said 5 weeks later they hired a PI.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why, if Mark committed this, once again, this is just an if, why he wouldn't go back and try to clean that up, because he would know eventually somebody's going to live in that house. So at least try to, I don't know.
And in the Unsolved Mysteries segment, they show, it looks like they're down in the basement, and they find plastic with blood on it. I mean, why wouldn't he have disposed of that?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure we have answers for that. That certainly could make us lean in a different direction. I'm just not sure what to think about that. But I thought we needed to explore, it a little bit more for the listeners. The way you understand the timeline for that night, anything weird about it? Did the babysitter ever say, well, you know what, Mark came home a little later than I thought, they were supposed to, have we...
No, the only thing she said is that she was surprised that they were going out because she knew that they weren't getting along.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like Mark and Christi each had their own reasons for going out that night, I believe, because Christi wanted to keep things calm till the next day when she could leave. And Mark wanted to kind of, I don't know whether you'd say an alibi, but all these people saw them that night.
Yeah.
And they seemed to be getting along fine.
Yeah.
So that...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's. I guess what I'm saying is that being that they were out, and then you said they were seen at a convenience store, I'm just wondering if anybody's ever been able to figure out the time between the convenience store and Mark getting home.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Because you have to. If we're to believe something happened between the convenience store and Mark getting home, then there has to be some time cut out in there for that to happen. That's, I guess, what I'm saying, and just wonder if anybody's saying, well, it should have only taken him 10 minutes to get home from that convenience store, but it took him an hour. No idea regarding that?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether they said when they were in the convenience store. I do know that it was between 12:30 and one, I believe, that they said that he came home to relieve the babysitter.
Okay.
But also, if you think about it, the big spot of concentrated blood would seem to indicate that she was laying there, not that there was a violent struggle going on in there.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you that is a plausible explanation, that the babysitter leaves, and then that's when he takes Christi inside. But the other thing is, that comes to mind is, well, if the floor of the house got bloody, then surely the car got really messed up. And I'm wondering how he ended up being able to sell those cars. If he didn't take time to clean up the house, I mean, how much work could he have done on the cars? I just don't know.
And he took one of the cars with him that day, and he was going to go clean out the car. So maybe if there was anything in there, he cleaned it out that next morning.
Could be. This is the things that I guess I'm going to dwell on. I'm sure you've thought about them a lot. That's why we're talking about them, and I'm sure the listeners.
And I mean, I've thought about. I could easily see Mark killing her in a fit of rage, but I actually do think that it was premeditated because of the timing of everything. I mean, he knew he didn't have much time, and she was at least going to officially take the kids. And the eerie part is the lawyer asked her that night, "Why don't you just go to your mom's right now?" And Christi refused. And then the abuse counselor wants her to leave right then, and she refused. I mean, her life could have been spared, either one of those. But, I mean, she wanted to do things, I guess, the right way. I'm not sure exactly what her reasoning would be, but it's just sad to think back that she could have agreed with one of those and just left right then. Yeah. I think she would have had so much, I think she would have lost her kids, honestly. Mark would have pulled some strings, and they would have returned the kids back to Mark, I believe.
Yeah. Being that you've looked into this, I'm going to guess that you're going to continue to work with Christi's family. And of course, we talked about maybe doing some work at the Nichols house if somebody else owns it now. I'd certainly like to keep posted on that. Anything in?
I did actually.
Please.
I do want to add, I contacted a few of the newspapers in the area because I wanted more attention locally to this case. And I contacted the North Platte Bulletin, which is, pretty close to Gothenburg, and they were very interested in the story. So they actually put Christi's picture on the front page and did a very in-depth article based on my blog.
Great.
So that got some more attention, and then the Gothenburg Leader, I believe, recently wrote an article, and I was in contact with her. She says she wants to keep it, in the spotlight there, which is a really good thing.
Okay, great. Now that you've of course lived with this disappearance for 30 years, almost as long as Christi's family has, being that you saw it on Unsolved Mysteries very early back then. Now that you've covered the case, you've written about it, like I said, I know you're going to continue to work on it. Anything that strikes you, anything that surprised you, some things that, you got into covering this case that you couldn't have expected back when you first learned about it back in the late 1980s?
Well, the Unsolved Mysteries segment, Mark came off so bad, and it was like, I was telling people, if you thought he looked bad before, wait till you hear the full story. And I don't know if you want to talk about the Facebook post that Mark had. That really shocked me.
Yeah, why don't you do that? I didn't put that in the outline. Why don't you do that? Sure. Why don't you mention that?
Well, I think it was several months or a couple of years ago, but I was looking on Mark's Facebook, and he posted, it's supposed to be a joke, like a meme, had a picture of a lawyer sign, and they were divorce lawyers, and their names were Ditcher, Quick, and Hyde, which, at the very least, is an extremely poor taste.
Yeah.
You have a wife that goes missing after she's wanting to file for divorce. It just kind of shows, he's never had to pay for anything.
Do you know of any reason that he would post that Is he going through another divorce? Is he having problems with another woman?
He did get divorced the third time, but I'm not sure when he got the third divorce.
Could he have posted that because he knew you wrote about Christi's disappearance?
No, he posted it way before I wrote about it. And I keep checking. I'm thinking maybe he'll think better of it, but it's still there, last I knew.
Okay. All right. So you live with this. How did it feel finally being able to write about it after knowing about it for so long, Heather?
It was great. It was great to get more attention. There really isn't that much out there. If it weren't for the Unsolved Mysteries segment, I mean, hardly anyone would even know about this case. But it was great to be able to put a lot more information out there, and, to somehow, I wouldn't want anyone to think that Christi just up and abandoned her children, because her actions right before that showed that she wasn't going to do that.
Yep, I agree with you. The listeners will be, I'm going to remind them right now, if they recognize your name, although I did not state this at the beginning of this interview, that you first joined us about a year and a half ago for Dale Kerstetter's disappearance, surely a unique one, one that you continue to work on to this day. In fact, just a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, you've made discoveries in that case regarding, theft that was similar to what happened in Dale's disappearance, much more common than we realized, possibly. And I thought that was really interesting, and I passed that on to the listeners. Any other cases that you've written upon recently that you think that they should know about? And why don't you give out the address for your blog?
Well, the address is lostandfoundblogs.com, and I've actually got 20 articles on there now, so I'm really building to the library. Mm-hmm. I did write an article a few months back about Pamela Page, and that's a very noteworthy Unsolved Mysteries segment as well. Mm-hmm. Spoke with her sister, and it's very similar, just up and goes missing one day. Husband very suspicious. Her body could never be found. Husband has since passed away. And as far as Dale, there continues to be development, and I actually had enough to write a second article about him as well. I've got even more information since then. Mm-hmm. But the biggest thing with that is that they did release the surveillance footage, which shocked everyone.
Yeah.
And it's in terrible shape, but I have a friend that's trying to clean it up to where it's noteworthy. And the biggest things that come out of that is that Dale was seen early on, and then he wasn't seen again for a few more hours, but the intruder continued to stay there. So it's interesting that Dale's not in the shot anymore after the early. So.
Right.
But yeah, hopefully things will continue to happen with that case as well. Yeah.
Yep. Nobody was more surprised than I was when you discovered the theft of the what is it, platinum, right? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Platinum, the theft of the platinum. That we thought, at least when I interviewed a year and a half ago, was fairly rare, but since then you looked into that and you found out that platinum theft was more common than we thought, at least back in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, yeah, and there was even other Corning plants that had platinum stolen.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, great job, Heather. Very, very, very impressed with that. Why don't you give out the name of your blog again, and then we will wrap this up. Maybe you need to spell it out, the address as well.
Okay, it's Lost and Found Blogs. So it's LOSTNFOUNDBLOGS.com.
Great. What the question I want to ask you next is, when is your next blog going to be coming out? When should the listeners be expecting it?
I'm actually finishing it up, so sometime in April. and I will be writing about Charlotte Polis, which is an excellent podcast that you had done a few years ago with her
2017,
brother.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Very similar to Christi's case, sadly.
It is.
Still missing.
It is. Charlotte's husband, very, very bad guy. Very similar.
Yeah.
And in fact, as we talked about before we started this interview, there is a element that his parents could have helped him if he did something to Charlotte, just like we talked about in Christi's disappearance.
Yeah.
Very similar.
Yeah, his father was very well connected as well.
Yeah. Okay. Heather, any last words before we complete this interview?
I just appreciate your work as well, how serious you take the cases, and I appreciate you asking me to be on again.
I love to feature people that do good work, Heather. So that's what I do. I think people know that I'm very, very, very picky about the people that I work with and network with, and they know I'm very picky about TV shows like this new show Tiger King, which I think is despicable in how it handles disappearance, which was probably a murder and everything. I like to surround myself, and I like to get to know people that I think doing a great job, and I like to feature them on the program. So that's why you're here, Heather.
I appreciate that.
You're very welcome, and thank you for being on this episode of Unfound.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And that was my interview with Heather Grotman, writer and owner of the lostandfoundblogs.com website. I thank her for again joining all of us on the program. I want to reiterate my appreciation for Heather and her doing things the right way. She doesn't just sit down and start writing. Heather takes the time to find family members and friends, to talk to them, to get to know them. She doesn't rush to put out her next blog. Heather doesn't care about being first. She cares about being right, and I commend her for that. And I also want to mention Anthony at crimeblogger1983.blogspot.com, who handles his website the exact same way. These are blogs all of you should be reading, not the ones that just rip off Wikipedia, WebSleuth, and the Charley Project. If any of you are thinking about starting your own disappearance website, Heather's and Anthony's are two very good examples to follow. And that brings us to my summation for Christi's disappearance. No matter how many different angles from which anyone tries to look at this case, her husband, Mark, has to be the prime suspect. He had the time, the motive, the means, and the history that shows he most likely harmed Christi, then disposed of her somewhere. Because really, there are no other persons of interest. Zero. This is like Rosemary Rapp's disappearance. Either you believe the husband caused the disappearance, or you have to put together some very, very unique scenario where women are able to get out of bed and to leave without their controlling, overprotective, obsessed, psycho husbands noticing. Do you see what I mean? Yet, even so, there are still some things in Christi's disappearance that don't quite make sense. Number one, the note under the driver's seat. Did she actually write it? Or if Mark wrote it as some kind of fake out, why do that at all? Would he not suspect that somebody would notice it wasn't Christi's handwriting? Or maybe Mark forced her to write it because he hurt her. I guess that's possible. We just don't know. Number two, the circle of blood on the floor in the bedroom. Why would Mark not clean that up before moving himself and the children out? Moreover, if the babysitter never saw Christi that night, and she doesn't believe Christi ever came inside that night, something I'm inclined to believe, then why would Mark then bring Christi's body inside after the babysitter left? Once again, I just don't know. Number three, the suitcase. If Mark killed Christi, it means he packed her suitcase, no doubt about it. But then why would he wait 3 months to place it where it was eventually found? Why not just drop it off there the Sunday of the disappearance, or shortly after? I don't know. That's the third time I've said that. The only thing that comes to mind is Mark felt he was about to be charged with Christi's murder, so he had to make it look like Christi was still alive 3 months later. Yet the big question is, where did he hide that suitcase for that period of time? My guess, at his parents' place where he was living. And that would probably mean they saw it, which then means they knew their son was lying about Christi and what happened. That would lend even more credence to the belief that Christi's remains are on the property where the parents used to live. This is why my best advice right now is to get a crew out on that land, digging and scanning and poking around. As for Bob Shackleton, once again we have a case with a crooked member of law enforcement. I won't go as far as to say that Bob knew Mark would kill Christi, if that's what happened, once again, and I'm not saying Bob covered anything up. But there's no doubt that Bob Shackleton knew there was violence in the Nichols marriage, and he did nothing about it. In fact, he was the one intimidating Christi to stay with Mark. However, I also have to criticize this counselor who agreed to meet Christi in Shackleton's office. What was she thinking? Did she not see what was going on? In fact, are we sure this wasn't just some setup? That it was a way to make Christi feel like she was getting help, when really, the counselor was just a tool of Mark and Shackleton? That has crossed my mind. Not sure if we'll ever be sure. What I'm saying is there were several people, Mark of course, but Shackleton, the counselor, doctors, and nurses who saw Christi's injuries. Whether Christi would have disappeared or not, these people all kept this cycle of abuse spinning. I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.